Okay, so we're ready to resume, and this is the first afternoon session on Saturday, September 1st. Okay, so now we come to the next stage in the Abhidhamma program, and now we'll be looking at suttas, discourses of the Buddha on the 6 or the 12 sense bases, and then later on the 18 elements. And it might be like some people are thinking, you said that this is an Abhidhamma course, but you're giving so much sutta material. Well, first of all, one thing I said last night is that we want to look at these topics from both points of view, from the Abhidhamma point of view and then from the sutta point of view. But also, we could say that these topics, even though we have many, many suttas on them, but we could say that these are the topics that form the original basis for the Abhidhamma. We could say that the Abhidhamma in its earliest stage originated as a kind of detailed examination of these topics like the 5 aggregates, the 12 sense bases, the 18 elements, 4 noble truths, the faculties, dependent origination, the Noble Eightfold Path. So as these subjects were investigated by later generations of Buddhists, then they began to elaborate upon them in more analytical detail and more systematic, aiming at more systematic completeness. And then we get the early stage of the Abhidhamma emerging. And then over generations, more generations and centuries, the system becomes more and more elaborate until we have the full-blown Abhidhamma. So when we look at these suttas on like the sense bases and the elements, then we're looking at the material that formed the original sort of nucleus or source for the unfolding of the Abhidhamma. Okay, so let us see what kind of suttas we have here. So now we come to suttas on the 6 sense bases. And sort of a question that can come up and that is not dealt with in any great detail in the suttas themselves, except in a few texts, is what is the relationship between the scheme of the 12 or 6 sense bases and the 5 aggregates. So we have 2 major schemes into which the Buddha has analyzed dharmas, phenomena. The 12 sense bases, the 5 aggregates, what is the relationship between them? How do they, mesh together? How can they be integrated? And first, to take the separate schemes of categories, why the Buddha has one scheme of 5 aggregates, one scheme of the 12 sense bases, and this seems to me to be the case. I don't think I've seen this in any text, but if we look at the suttas on the 5 aggregates, we see that the main purpose that is hammered at again and again is to overcome, to eliminate what is called Sakkaya Ditthi. So Sakkaya Ditthi is the view of a self, and the view of a self existing in relation to the 5 aggregates. And because like the 5 aggregates include more material than the 12 sense bases, even though 12 sense bases is 12, 5 aggregates is 5. But we can see that the 5 aggregates have a wider range, at least a wider range, more explicitly a wider range. So we have material form, then explicitly mentioned as feeling, then mentioned perception, then mentioned the sankharas, the volitional activities, and then consciousness. So when a view of self arises, it tends to arise by identifying one or another of these 5 aggregates, or the whole group of them, with the self. This is mine, this I am, this is myself. So there's a tendency for the view of self to be more firmly connected with the 5 aggregates than the 12 sense bases. Even though, of course, the view of self can latch onto anything, but it's a matter of emphasis. And so what we see again and again in the Buddha's discourses on the 5 aggregates, that he proceeds through the characteristic, this is impermanent, what's impermanent is unsatisfactory, dukkha, what is unsatisfactory is non-self, therefore contemplate form, feeling, perception, mental formations, the consciousness, this is not mine, this I am not, this is not myself. So it seems in relation to the 5 aggregates, the target is that view of self. And when the view of self is eliminated, where does one stand? At what stage on the path? Right. So in eliminating the view of self, one is a stream enterer. But beyond stream entry, there are still 3 more stages of the path. And even the stream enterer, even the once returner, still can be victimized very strongly by craving. In fact, craving goes all the ways up, right up to the attainment of arhatship. And craving arises most prominently on the basis of sense experience. So it seems the teaching on the 12 aggregates takes its special target to be the eradication of craving. Okay, so now coming back to a sutta that relates or correlates the 6 sense bases and the 5 aggregates, we find this discourse in the Majjhima Nikaya spoken by the Venerable Sariputta. It's the number 28. Wow. 27. Yeah, this is the greater discourse on the lion? No. I think I'm getting amnesia. The elephant's footprint simile, of course, not the lion's roar. The elephant's, the larger discourse on the elephant's footprint simile. Okay, so here's Sariputta speaking. Let me bring this down one level. Okay, so he's saying he's speaking to the monks, he says, if the I is intact, but no external forms come into its range, then there is no corresponding act of attention, then there is no manifestation of the corresponding class of consciousness. That is, I consciousness doesn't arise. Okay, if the I is intact and external forms come into its range, but there is no corresponding act of attention. I'm listening to a beautiful concerto by Mozart, and so different pictures are coming in, or different things are coming into my range of vision, but I'm not paying any attention to them. And so there's no arising of the corresponding type of I consciousness. Okay, but when the I is intact and external forms come into its range, and there is the corresponding act of attention, then there is the manifestation of the corresponding class of consciousness. Now you see, just 1 minute ago, I was barely aware, even I could say I was unaware that there was a vase of flowers here. Because my attention was on the computer screen and on how am I going to explain this. Then suddenly, something happened that caught my attention. So the attention turned, whoop, I saw Venerable Genja coming up, closer, closer, what she's going to do. Then I saw suddenly, wow, there's a vase of flowers there. And now it's gone. Okay, so when the eye is intact and external forms come into its range, and there is the corresponding act of attention, that is attention to the visible forms, then there is the arising, the manifestation of the corresponding class of consciousness, that is eye consciousness. And so, now he goes on. So this is, you could say, this is a process involving the six, or at least one of the sense bases and its object, visible forms and the eye. Okay, now he's going to bring the five aggregates into that. So the material form in what has thus come to be is included in the material form aggregate. So in the act of seeing, first we need the whole physical body, functioning physical body, to be there and to be awake. So that is in the material form aggregate. But then the special part of the material form aggregate that's involved in the act of seeing is the eye. The eye has to be intact. And then there's the object itself, the visible form that is perceived. So that all of those things, the entire physical body, and especially the eye base, and the visible form base. So those fit into the material form aggregate. And now whenever there is a consciousness, an eye consciousness, seeing a form, there's some feeling associated with that act of consciousness. You might think, oh, I see millions of things and I don't have any real feeling about them. That just means that you don't have a very prominent pleasant feeling or a prominent painful feeling. But when you're looking at things and there's no special feeling present, there is a feeling, but that's the feeling that we call a dukkha sukha vedana, the feeling that's not painful, not pleasant, or more simply we call it neutral feeling. Okay, so there's a feeling present, there is a perception, so the form comes into range, and you say that eye consciousness is what provides the awareness, the light of awareness arising through the eye, but what focuses in on that form and is able to identify it as, this is the form of Venerable Panyarakita, this is the form of Stephen, this is the form of Venerable Mangala. So what identifies the visible form, that is perception. And then in response to the perception, some kind of volitional activities arise. I have to tell Venerable Panyarakita some message. I have to thank Stephen for providing a card, a memory card for the recorder. So some volitional activities occur. So that is the sankhara khandha. And then there's this awareness of this whole field of experience. That is the consciousness. So that is the consciousness aggregate. And so in that way, we see how through the sense bases, the five aggregates come to be. And so I just took the part of the sutta concerned with visible form and the eye, but the same thing in the sutta is repeated for each of the other five sense bases and their objects. If we wanted to make, maybe this will be interesting, if we make the sense, that's making, starting with the sense bases and then relating them to the five aggregates, what if we take the five aggregates and try to think where they figure among the 12 sense bases. Okay, so we have 5 types of physical sense faculties, 5 physical sense bases: eye, ear, nose, tongue, and body. Which aggregate will they fit in? Right. Okay, so here we have 5 internal bases. And then we have their corresponding objects, the visible form, sound, odor, taste, tactile impressions. Where amongst the sense bases amongst the aggregates do they fit? Right, they come into the form aggregate. Okay, then to make things easy, let's go to the last one, consciousness. Where does that come? Okay, so this is the mind base. Okay, so now we come to the problem that the formulators of the Abhidhamma encountered when they start with the premise that the 12 bases are all, that they have to include everything. And so now we have 10 bases are accounted for. So we're including all of material form, distributing it into those 10 sense bases. Consciousness is in the mind base. But what are we going to do with feeling, perception, volitional activities? Those 3. Okay. So that's a good answer. So these became included into the what's called the Dhammayatana. For convenience, I'll just call this the Dhamma base. Okay, so in that way we get the 5 aggregates correlated with the 12 sense bases. So it seems a little problematic to me. This is why I find the problem, because it seems that if we look at the actual content, okay, of the other 5 external bases, form, sound, odor, taste, tactile object, they're obviously the objects of awareness, objects of consciousness. Yet here, the range of the Dhamma base is being expanded so that it includes not only the object of mano, but the objects of mind, but also the mental factors that go along with consciousness. So it's not only object, but also the companions of the consciousness, the associates of consciousness. Okay, let's move along now. Okay, last night in my introductory talk, I explained how the Buddha speaks of the world in the Noble Discipline as being that in the world by which one is a perceiver and knower of the world. And then he says, what is that in the world by which one is a knower and perceiver of the world? The eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind. Okay, in this sutta, a monk comes to the Buddha and says, he uses this expression, the world, the world. What is it that we speak of as the world? How is it that we speak about the world? And here the Buddha explains the world by means of a pun, a wordplay, which actually technically, it's not that I'm correct, criticizing the Buddha's knowledge of Pali, but it's a wordplay, which it's not really accurate. And so we have in Pali the word that represents world is loka. And now he's explaining this on the basis of a verb, lujati. Now there's actually no, excuse me. There's no real direct relationship between the word loka and lujati. It's just like they look similar, but the word loka comes from, I don't remember the origin of it, but it's not based on the verb lujati. But there is a verb in Pali, lujati, which means to disintegrate, to fall apart, to break apart. And so the Buddha then explains the world on the basis of that verb that looks similar, lujati. So he says, it is disintegrating, therefore it is called the world. So in Pali, it's lujati, tiko. I think I did a global change and then bhikkhu became monk. Okay. So lujati, tasma lokoti vuchati. Vuchati means is called, tasma means therefore. So because it falls apart, it disintegrates, it is called the world. And so what is disintegrating? So the I is disintegrating, forms are disintegrating, I consciousness, eye contact, and the feeling based on eye contact, that too is disintegrating. And so the ear, nose, tongue, body, mind, the mind objects, the mind consciousness, mind contact, the feeling arisen from mind contact, all of that is disintegrating. And so when the Buddha says disintegrating, it doesn't mean only that at death all of this comes to an end. But again, this is from the perspective of the penetrative insight into the nature of the body and the sense faculties and the mind and its way of cognizing, that when you see it, close up with penetrative insight, one sees that all of these sense faculties and their objects, the consciousness arisen from them, everything is arising and then breaking apart and falling away, moment after moment after moment. So there's nothing stable, nothing reliable in this process of becoming. It's all just constantly undergoing disintegration. And then another way to look at this is in terms of burning. And so this is the famous, what's called the fire sermon that the Buddha gave early in his teaching career. And he gave it to a group of 1,000 monks. And there's a reason, underlying reason why the Buddha gave this sutta specifically in terms of burning. Okay, the reason, this is the story behind the sutta, and we find this related in the Mahavagga. It's one of the books of the Vinaya Pitaka, which describes the beginning of the Buddha's teaching career. So after the Buddha had converted his first group of about 60 disciples, he sent the monks off in different directions. And he himself went to a place where there was a group of fire ascetics. These were ascetics, they're kind of jatila ascetics, who they wear their hair in these matted locks coming down. They don't cut the hair, and they have the long beards. You still see them in India today. And their practice is the worship of the sacred fire. And so the Buddha went, there were actually 3 groups of fire ascetics. And so the Buddha went to I think it was the largest group, and the heads of the 3 groups were 3 brothers. I think there was Gaya Kassapa, Nadi Kassapa, I don't remember the third one. But he went to the oldest brother with the largest group, and he said, "Can I stay here for a few days?" And they said, "Okay, you can stay." And then the Buddha stayed there, and some different events took place, and the Buddha used his psychic powers to perform what's so-called miraculous events. And each time the head of the group thought that he himself was an arahat. And so when he would see the Buddha performing these miraculous events, he would think, that ascetic is very powerful, but he's not an arahat like me. And this went on again and again, one event after another, till finally the Buddha thought, I've been patient enough with this Gaya Kassapa. And the Buddha is reading his mind when he's thinking, the ascetic is powerful, but he's not an arhat like me. So then, at a certain point, when the Buddha performed one of these miraculous events, I think it was subduing a fierce dragon that dwelt at that hermitage. Then the ascetic, the matted hair ascetic, again thought, the great ascetic is powerful, but he's not an arhat like me. And on that occasion, then the Buddha said, Kassapa, I'm sorry to tell you this, but you're not an arhat, and you're not even on the path to arhatship. And as soon as the Buddha said that, Kassapa didn't think, I'm going to argue with him. How arrogant of him. He's a visitor, and he's denigrating me. But rather, Kassapa immediately got up and bowed down to the Buddha and said, you are the teacher, accept me as your disciple. And so then the Buddha taught Kassapa, and then he accepted Kassapa and his disciples into the order of monks. So now they had, I think, 500. There were 500 ascetics in that group. They became monks. And then they took all of their fire implements and threw them into the river. And then the ascetics, the group further down the river of 300, came up. They thought some calamity has happened to our elder brother. So they came up wondering what happened. And they saw Kassapa, Gaya Kassapa, and his group of ascetics no longer have the matted locks and the long beards and their tattered robes, but now they're all shaven, well shaven, and they're wearing the ochre robes of the Buddhist monks. And so then they asked about the teaching of the Buddha, and they accepted the Buddha's teaching. And then the next group came up from their place further down the river. 200 ascetics come up, and they see all of their 2 brothers and all of their disciples. Now 800 of them have become monks, Buddhist monks, and they learn the teaching. They become monks following the Buddha. So now there's 1,000 former fire ascetics have now become disciples of the Buddha. And then the Buddha travels with them to this place called Gaya's Head, and then he gives them this discourse, the fire sermon. So the Buddha is formulating his teaching in terms of fire, because that was the form of practice of the 1,000 ascetics. So immediately it's sort of, this is the Buddha's skillful means, is that he'll teach to the listener in ways that the listener can understand. So if he were speaking today to, say, an automobile mechanic, he might speak about riding the car to the city of nirvana. To a bus driver, a bodhisattva, taking many people on the bus to the city of nirvana. Okay, so here he's saying that all is burning. So what is burning? The eye forms, eye consciousness, eye contact, and so forth. And then he brings in, now he's showing what it's burning with. What is that fire? So it's burning with the fire of raga, of lust, the fire of hatred and aversion, the fire of delusion. So those are the three unwholesome roots. And so we take these three fires, then if we were to go back to our chart of the Chittas from the Abhidhamma Sangaha. Oh, I closed it. I don't want to open it again. So those would be the Chittas associated with greed, the Chittas associated with hatred, and then all the unwholesome Chittas are associated with delusion. And so in the Abhidhamma, they speak in rather flat terms of lobha sahagata, dosa sahagata, moha sahagata, associated with greed, associated with aversion, associated with delusion. But here, for the purpose of driving home the message to these former fire ascetics, the Buddha speaks of all of these things burning with the fire of lust, hatred, and delusion. So those of you could say those are the causal fires, and then the result fires are birth, old age, and death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, dejection, and despair. So the fires of lust, hate, and delusion drive us into new birth, old age, and death. And in our day-to-day life, these are the fires that cause sorrow, weeping, pain, sadness, despair. So the air, nose, tongue, body, mind, and everything arisen from them is burning with those same fires. Okay, another way to look at the sense bases. Actually, this is interesting. It just occurred to me. Okay, in this sutta we have sort of the key term is disintegrating. So of the three familiar characteristics, the universal characteristics, what is the characteristic that's prominent here? Exactly. So this is the mark of impermanence. In the next one, burning, sort of what is the characteristic of the three characteristics that's prominent here? Right, so this is dukkha, suffering. And then the third one, it's just by chance that I happen to paste these suttas in. You see that they're not following one after another within the collection. This is number 28. This was 82. This is 85. And so here, Ananda comes to the Buddha and says that the world is empty. The world is empty. In what way, in what sense is it said the world is empty? And here at the key word, empty, this is the word sunya. So it's, in Pali, it's sunyo loko, sunyo loko. And of course, that is the word that's the basis for sunyata, the concept that plays such a prominent role in the later, especially in the early Mahayana Buddhism. And so then the Buddha answers, so why is the world said to be empty? So because it is empty of the self and empty of anything belonging to the self. And so this is a mode of analysis or a mode of explanation that's really aimed sort of directly at the prominent Brahminic idea of the Atman, the self, as being the foundation of the world. So according especially to texts like the Upanishads, like the world is just an emanation, a projection, or even an illusion superimposed upon a permanent underlying reality. And that reality is called Brahman, and it's also called Atman, the self. So the innermost self of the person is the underlying basis or ground of the world. And so the aspiration for the disciple in the system of the Upanishads is to penetrate through the illusion of the individual personality and discover within the depths of the personality that permanent reality, the Atman, which is also identical with the Brahman, the underlying support for the world. And the Buddha sort of turned that system upside down by saying that the world is empty. So we think firstly of the world out there as empty, not in the sense that, like the French existentialists, everything is meaningless and purposeless. Life is just an empty shadow. But rather that there's no fundamental ground for the world and no innermost essence for what we call ourselves. But it's all empty of any kind of substantial identity. And so then the Buddha then goes on to explain what is empty of self and of what belongs to self. And then he does this by way of the 12 sense bases. So the I is empty of a self. So there's no self behind the I, which is using it to see forms. And it's empty of anything that belongs to self. So I can't say the I is mine, that I have some self in here that owns the I. Then forms are empty of self. I consciousness, wow, this is really getting a little painful. Because if there's anything that we identify as being what I really am myself, it's consciousness. We could say the body can fall away, but the consciousness has to go on as the same self, the soul. But for the Buddha, first consciousness is broken up into the 6 types of consciousness, and each one is empty of a self and of anything that belongs to self. So I can't even say when I see things that the seer is myself, because the seer is just I consciousness, which arises and passes empty of self. And so eye contact, the corresponding feeling, all, I cut out too much, I should have also included, it goes on with each of the other sense bases, up to the mind objects, the dhammas, mind consciousness, mind contact, the feeling born of mind contact, all of that. I see that I abridged it. So the feeling arisen with mind contact as condition, that too is empty of self and of what belongs to self. So here we can see the characteristic of anatta, non-self. Okay, here we have another sutta that emphasizes impermanence. And this is sort of going to be demonstrating directly how consciousness is impermanent. Okay, so this sutta begins that consciousness comes to be in dependence on a dyad. Whoops. A dyad means a pair of things. So how does consciousness come to be in dependence on a dyad? Okay, so first, in dependence on the I and forms, there arises I consciousness. So the I, or I consciousness, takes the I organ as its internal base and the visible forms as the external base. So the I consciousness, we could say, is standing on two bases. Not very good bases. So I consciousness is standing on these two bases. And these two bases are impermanent, changing, becoming otherwise. The forms are impermanent, changing, and becoming otherwise. So while consciousness has arisen, it's resting on the I, but the I is changing. It's cognizing forms, but the forms are changing. And so the text says this dyad is chalang and byatang, means it's moving and tottering, collapsing. So it's impermanent, changing, becoming otherwise. And since consciousness, I consciousness, arises on the basis of things that are changing, so this is the cause and condition for the arising of I consciousness, is impermanent, changing, becoming otherwise. So that's the I and forms. So when I consciousness has arisen in dependence on a condition, or these two conditions that are impermanent, how could I consciousness be permanent? So even when one is seeing something, it seems the form is lasting, it seems the I is lasting. But again, through the application of consistent and precise mindfulness and attention to the I and to forms, one sees that the forms and the I are changing, changing, changing. And for that reason, the I consciousness itself, even when seeing one object, I'm looking at this red cap for the cup. So it seems that the red is lasting, the I is lasting. But if I had that penetrative insight, I would see that the red of the form is always changing, and the I is always changing. And so my perception or awareness of the red is always changing moment to moment. It's just that visible forms seem to have greater degree of stability. But if you take a sound and you pay very close attention to a sound, you could see in what seems to be a lasting sound that is just a string of moments of sound with some degree of continuity, and that gives the appearance of stability. Okay, so this is said in regard to the I, and then the I consciousness. Okay, now it continues, the meeting, encounter, concurrence of these three things. The I forms an I consciousness. That is eye contact. And eye contact, too, is impermanent, changing, and becoming otherwise. Because the cause and condition for eye contact, that is the form, the I consciousness, those are changing and becoming otherwise. So when eye contact depends on the condition that's impermanent, how could it be permanent? Eye contact also impermanent. Okay, now through contact, one feels. So that is the aggregate of feeling. Through contact, one intends, that is volition occurs. That is the aggregate of the sankharas, the volitional activities. Contacted, one perceives. And so these things arise based on a condition that's impermanent. So these things too are moving, tottering, impermanent, changing, becoming otherwise. Okay, and then that same basic exposition is applied to each of the other sense bases. And so it's said in such a way, it is in such a way that consciousness comes to be in dependence on a dyad. So here you could see of the three characteristics, the stress is on impermanence. Okay, here is an interesting sutta, or a sutta with an interesting simile that we'll see. Okay, so now the Buddha says that whatever is not yours, abandon it, because you've entered upon the life of renunciation, becoming a monk or nun, so you have to give up what's not yours. Don't make any claims. That's mine. I have a nice iPhone. I have a nice computer. Maybe have nice house or room, nice other things. But what's not yours, give it up. Of course, you have to keep your robe. You don't go around like a naked ascetic. And certain things you have to use. But what's not yours, give up your attachment to it. So you think, okay, I've given up my attachment to all of these external things. I've renounced the world. But now the Buddha says, what's not yours, abandon it. And then when you have abandoned it, what you actually abandon is the attachment to it. That will bring for you welfare and happiness. And then the Buddha raises the question, what is it that is not yours? The I is not yours. Abandon it. What? The I is not mine? Yes, the I is not yours. It's empty, right? It's changing and becoming otherwise. I can't control the I and say, in fact, I have a kind of visual distortion. It's called a macular pucker. So when I look at especially when reading off the computer screen, too long, I will see like two images of the screen sort of superimposed upon each other. And sometimes one comes to the foreground, one goes into the background. And then I have also, I think related to that, is this condition, macular degeneration, particularly in the right eye. So if I go like this, wow, the lines are wavy. The lines of print are wavy. But if the eye was really mine, I should be able to say to it, Go away, you macular pucker. Let me see the screen, just one image of the screen. And go away, macular degeneration, so that I don't have to look at these wavy lines. But the eye is not mine, I can't control it. Okay, forms are not yours, eye consciousness is not yours, eye contact is not yours. Okay, then the ear is not yours. Okay, in time, the faculty of hearing starts to degenerate. The nose is not yours, the tongue is not yours. Perhaps when you get older, the tongue loses its acuity. The body is not yours. Hey, I want to be 21 years old again, to have a body like a 21-year-old young man, but not possible. Why are you laughing? The mind is not yours. Wait a minute. If the mind were really mine, I'd never forget anything. I just have to say, remember everything that you've ever learned, everything you've ever heard. Work as quickly as I want, so it'll work like a 10-speed processing 100-speed processing computer. So all of this I have no control over, so this is not mine. And so if I'm attached to it, then I get really worried. Oh, I'm so miserable. I'm seeing 2 images on the screen. Oh, the lines are wavy, broken. Then if the faculty of hearing degenerates, I can't hear so well. And if the tongue degenerates, so I eat the most delicious food, I don't get the real sharp taste of it. But when I give up that attachment, then I can move freely and happily, even when these things start to degenerate. And then the Buddha uses the simile to illustrate his point. He says, suppose people, they're staying in the monastery, Jeta's Grove. So the Buddha points to the grass, the broken sticks, the branches, and the leaves. And he says, suppose people were to remove the grass, the sticks, the branches, and so on, take them away, carry them off to use as firewood, and burn them or use them for some other purpose. Would you think people are carrying off us, they're burning us, they're using us for some purpose? And the monks say, no, because that's not our self. That doesn't belong to us. It's just stuff here in Jeta's Grove. And so the Buddha says, in the same way, that eye is not yours, the ear, nose, tongue, body, mind is not yours. Give up the attachment to it, and that will lead to your welfare and happiness. Okay, now this is a very important sutta that we come to now. It's a sutta on karma. And the Buddha says, I will teach you old karma and new karma, the cessation of karma and the way leading to the cessation of karma. And then he says, what is old karma? The I is old karma. Here the Pali uses some difficult terms, which I translate very roughly, to be seen as generated and fashioned by volition as something to be felt. The words that are used in the Pali are, whoops. Okay, so abhisankatang means, sankatang means put together by conditions. And then abhisanchetayitang means, you could see here, cheta here, which is the stem or the base of the word chetana, volition. So this is put together through volitional activity. So abhisankatang, put together by a number of conditions, and then abhisanchetayitang, put together through volition, the activity of volition. And so this implies that the I is a product of volitional activity. And so the way this is explained is that the reason why we acquire a physical body with these 5 sense faculties, these particular 5 sense faculties, is because in our past existence we've had a craving to experience the world in terms of sight, sound, odor, taste, and touch. So that craving was there, that craving for the experience of the world by means of those 5 sense faculties. And that craving is accompanied by the karmic forces that have created a body equipped with these 5 physical sense faculties. And so in this sense, the eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and then the mind are products of past karma. So it's through that craving to experience the world in this way and the appropriate type of karma that we come into a body and a mind that can experience the world through the eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind. So in that sense, these 5 or 6 sense bases, literally they're not karma. They're not really old karma in the literal sense, because karma is action. But literally they are, you could say that they are the products of karma, that they're produced through craving and karma working together. And then what is the new karma? The new karma is whatever action, whatever volitional or intentional action one does now by body, speech, or mind. So that's the new karma. And this new karma has the potential to produce, to bring into being another organism in the future that will be equipped with eye, ear, nose, tongue, and body, and mind. Unless, of course, one creates the karma that might lead to becoming a being with some different set of sense faculties. Then one will experience the world differently through those sense faculties. Okay, what is the cessation of karma? When one reaches liberation. Actually, one doesn't really reach liberation through the cessation of bodily action, verbal action, and mental action. Of course, one doesn't stop acting, but one eliminates the craving that drives that kind of action. And then the way to the cessation of karma is the Noble Eightfold Path. Okay, at this point, I think it's time that we take a break. So, let's see. Yeah, from 3:10 to 3:30, so we'll take a 20-minute break. So please do come back, be sure to be back in your seats by 3:30. We'll give 2 minutes more. 3:32.